Daniel Harper here. Let me ask you something. What happens when the most powerful man in the world tries to break a country every single week, and that country doesn't bend? Not once, not twice, but month after month. Tariffs, annexation jokes, bridge blockades, aircraft threats, trade shutdowns, even quiet meetings with separatists. And yet every time the pressure escalated, Canada didn't collapse. It adapted. Today I'm going to show you how a weekly pressure campaign turned into a strategic mistake, how every threat revealed leverage Washington didn't know Ottawa had, and how Mark Carney used that leverage to quietly redraw the balance of power in North America. This isn't about headlines, it's about strategy, it's about sovereignty, and it's about who actually controls the future of continental trade. If you appreciate deep, detailed analysis that goes beyond the noise, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because stories like this are shaping the world in real time. Now let's break this down. Trump did not threaten Canada once. He did not threaten twice. He threatened Canada with a new weapon every single week for months. Tariffs on everything. Tariffs on aircraft, annexation, blocking a bridge, ending trade talks, calling the Prime Minister governor, sending officials to meet with separatists in Alberta. Every week, a new pressure point, a new attempt to break Canadian resistance. And every single time, Mark Carney had an answer, sometimes 4 sentences on a phone call, sometimes a trade deal with China signed while Trump was still posting about it. The pattern that emerged over this period is not a story about Canadian stubbornness. It is a story about a strategy. Carney understood something Washington did not. Every threat revealed what the United States actually needed from Canada, and every demand handed Ottawa a piece of leverage it had not previously known it held. Today, we are showing you how Trump's weekly pressure campaign worked, what each threat was actually designed to do, and how Carney turned every single one of them into an argument for why Canada needed to be less dependent on the United States. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. So why does Trump keep threatening Canada? Before you can understand the threats, you have to understand what Canada actually is. Canada is the second largest country on Earth by total area. It holds the world's largest per capita reserves of fresh water, the third largest proven oil reserves. It sits on deposits of lithium, nickel, cobalt, uranium, and rare earth elements that the United States needs desperately to compete with China in electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and military technology. And it controls the Northwest Passage, an Arctic sea route that climate change is making navigable for the first time in recorded history, potentially the most strategically important shipping corridor of the 21st century. Justin Trudeau said it directly. Trump's threat to absorb Canada was real, motivated by his desire to access Canada's critical minerals. The easiest way to do that is absorption. When a country has what you need, you either buy it, trade for it, or take it. Trump could not take it, so he chose economic pressure. The arithmetic behind the pressure campaign is straightforward. The United States imports more than $83 billion in Canadian critical minerals every year. China controls roughly 60% of global critical mineral production and has already demonstrated its willingness to weaponize that control through export restrictions. The American military, the American electric vehicle industry, the American semiconductor supply chain, all of them are running on materials that China could cut off at any moment. Canada is the closest, most reliable, most politically accessible alternative. Getting control of Canadian resources without paying Canadian prices is the strategic goal underneath every tariff and every threat. Then there is the Arctic. Canada controls 1 to 3 of the Arctic coastline and a quarter of Arctic territory. The Northwest Passage runs through Canadian waters. Canada claims those waters as internal. The United States has never accepted that claim. As the ice melts and the passage becomes viable for commercial shipping, whoever controls it controls the fastest sea route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. That argument has been ongoing for decades. Trump has simply decided to press it more aggressively than any previous president. Steve Bannon described Canada's Arctic as its soft underbelly. The Trump administration's national security strategy introduced what it called the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the same 19th century principle that claimed American dominance over the entire Western Hemisphere. Under that framework, Canada is not a sovereign ally. It is a territory within the American sphere that has not yet been brought into alignment. That is the context for every tariff, every threat, every mocking reference to Canada as the 51st state. This is not a trade dispute about dairy or aircraft certification or digital streaming laws. Those are the stated pretexts. The actual dispute is about whether Canada controls its own resources, its own waterways, and its own economic relationships, or whether those things belong to Washington by default. Carney understood this before most of the Canadian political class did. His entire strategy since taking office has been built around the same answer. Canada will decide what Canada does with what Canada owns. That is what makes every threat backfire, because the harder Washington pushes, the more obvious the underlying intent becomes. And the more obvious the intent, the more Canada accelerates the partnerships that make unilateral American control of Canadian resources permanently impossible. Trump's first move against Canada was the one he used as justification for everything that followed: fentanyl. The claim was that Canada had become a source of fentanyl flowing into the United States and was failing to stop it. Trump invoked emergency powers, declared a national emergency, and imposed 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods, claiming the measure was necessary to address a public health crisis at the northern border. The numbers told a different story. The vast majority of fentanyl entering the United States comes through the southern border, not the northern one. Canadian seizures of fentanyl at the border were a fraction of a percent of total American fentanyl deaths. The Drug Enforcement Administration's own data showed that Canada was not a major source, but the emergency declaration gave Trump the legal mechanism he needed to impose tariffs without congressional approval. The fentanyl framing was the key to unlocking the legal authority. Canada responded with retaliatory tariffs on billions of dollars in American goods. Provincial governments added surcharges. Ontario threatened to cut electricity to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. The message from Ottawa was consistent from the beginning. Every American action would be matched quietly, methodically, without drama. The fentanyl justification also created a permanent problem for Washington. Having declared a national emergency over Canadian fentanyl, the administration had to maintain that fiction every time it wanted to escalate. Every tariff increase required the same claim, and every claim became less credible as the months passed with no evidence of Canada as a meaningful fentanyl source. Alongside the tariffs, Trump deployed something that no previous American president had ever aimed at Canada. He called it the 51st state. Repeatedly on Truth Social, in press conferences at Davos, in meetings with foreign leaders, to the Canadian Prime Minister's face. The intent was not serious geopolitical annexation. It was humiliation, a suggestion that Canada's sovereignty was conditional on American goodwill, that the only safe future for Canada was absorption into the United States. Language normally reserved for conquered territories aimed at a G7 ally. It backfired spectacularly. Canadian nationalism surged to levels not seen in generations. Boycott of American products spread across the country. 71% of Canadians told pollsters they were less likely to buy American goods. Tourism to the United States dropped sharply. The phrase elbows up entered the national vocabulary. Carney turned the 51st state threat into his central campaign argument. He won the April election with the message that Trump was trying to break Canada so America could own it. The threat designed to humiliate him made him the most popular leader Canada had produced in years. Trump called Carney a very nice gentleman after the election. The annexation talk did not stop entirely, but it stopped leading every conversation. The aircraft threat was technically creative and practically unworkable. Trump threatened to decertify all aircraft made in Canada, specifically calling out Bombardier's Global Express business jets and impose 50% tariffs on any Canadian planes sold to the United States. The stated reason was that Canadian regulators were blocking the certification of American-made Gulfstream jets. There was a problem with this approach. Close to 1,000 Canadian-built aircraft were already operating in the United States at American Airlines. American Airlines and Delta both operated Bombardier models. Decertifying those planes would not hurt Canada. It would ground aircraft that American carriers had already purchased and were actively using for domestic routes. The Federal Aviation Administration, not the President, holds the authority to certify or decertify aircraft. A White House official quietly told reporters the next day that Trump was not suggesting decertifying planes already in operation, only new aircraft. The threat had already been walked back before Ottawa even had to respond. Bombardier reached out to the Canadian government. Canada's transport minister said the situation could be resolved. The certification process continued on its normal timeline, and the 50% tariff on Canadian aircraft never materialized. What the aircraft episode revealed was the pattern that would repeat itself. The announcement created headlines. The implementation collapsed under its own contradictions. Canada waited out the initial post instead of overreacting, and the threat quietly disappeared. Carney traveled to Davos in January of this year before Trump arrived. That sequencing was deliberate. He stood at the World Economic Forum and delivered the speech that changed the conversation. He said stronger countries had been using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, supply chains as vulnerabilities to exploit. He called it a rupture. The old order of rules-based trade was ending. Middle powers had to act together because if you were not at the table, you were on the menu. He did not name the United States. He did not have to. The audience understood. European leaders applauded. The speech made international headlines. Carney had arrived at the world's most visible economic forum and positioned Canada not as a victim of American pressure, but as a voice for a new global order of middle powers, resisting economic coercion from great powers. Trump responded by threatening 100% tariffs on Canadian goods if Canada made a trade deal with China. He called Carney governor, the same mocking term he had used for Justin Trudeau, and he said he would not get the leftovers if China ate Canada alive. Carney had already signed the China agreement. Canola tariffs dropped from 85% to 6.1%. Electric vehicle tariffs dropped from 100% to 6.1%. $7 billion in new export markets opened. The deal was done before Trump finished posting about it. The China move was the clearest demonstration of Carney's strategy. Do not announce the alternative before you have it. Build it, then announce it. By the time Trump threatened to punish Canada for the China deal, the deal was already signed and the markets were already responding. The most extraordinary episode in the entire pressure campaign was not a IIZ tariff. It was a meeting. Reports emerged that Trump administration officials had met directly with far-right separatists in Alberta Canadians who wanted to break their province off from the rest of Canada and attach it to the United States. Washington had gone beyond threatening Canada's trade relationship. It was now actively trying to fracture Canada's internal political unity. Alberta has genuine grievances with Ottawa over energy policy and equalization payments. A separatist current that occasionally appeared on the edges of conservative politics had been gaining traction under the pressures of the trade war. Trump officials meeting with those separatists sent one message. If Canada will not yield on trade terms, the United States will encourage the province with the oil to leave. Carney's response was to govern. Federal and provincial officials appeared together publicly on the tariff file. The biennial campaign crossed provincial lines deliberately, and Carney made clear that Canadian sovereignty was not a negotiating position. It was a starting point. When the Alberta separatist talks became public, the backlash was immediate. Even Albertans with real grievances against Ottawa were uncomfortable with the image of American officials meeting their countrymen to discuss dissolving their nation. Washington's involvement made the movement look less like a domestic grievance and more like an American operation. Steve Bannon called Canada's Arctic its soft underbelly and said Canada could be the next Ukraine. The framing was not trade policy. It was geopolitical destabilization, and Canada's answer was to accelerate the partnerships that made it less destabilizable. Luxembourg, China, Europe, and a growing network of relationships that gave Ottawa options beyond the single relationship Washington was trying to use as a choke point. In October of last year, the Ontario provincial government ran a television advertisement in the United States. The ad featured former President Ronald Reagan's voice making arguments against tariffs. Trump called it a fraud, said it was designed to influence American court cases about his tariff authority, ended all trade negotiations with Canada, announced a 10% tariff increase on top of the existing 35%. Over an advertisement paid for by a provincial government, not the Canadian federal government. A television commercial that quoted a Republican president. Ontario Premier Doug Ford pulled the advertisement. Ford said if pulling an ad could restart negotiations that would protect millions of Canadian jobs, he would pull the ad. He pulled it. Trump quietly did not impose the additional 10% tariff. But the episode revealed something significant about how Trump was choosing his pressure points. He was not targeting Canadian policies with clear economic justifications. He was targeting symbols, an advertisement, a bridge, a certification process, each one framed as a betrayal of American trust, each one a pretext for escalation that had nothing to do with the underlying trade dispute. Carney's government had not run the advertisement, but Carney was being held responsible for it. The lesson Ottawa took from that episode was that maintaining federal discipline over every provincial action was now a trade war necessity. Provincial governments had become front lines in a conflict they had not started. What Washington did not account for is what the Ontario ad episode did to ordinary Canadians. The image of a government pulling a television commercial because the American president found it offensive was not a sign of capitulation in Canadian eyes. It was a humiliation, and humiliation produces a specific kind of economic response that no tariff can manufacture. Canadian consumers turned their wallets into a weapon. A nano survey conducted after the Ontario ad controversy found that 71% of Canadians said they were less likely to buy American goods than before the trade war. That number had risen 8 percentage points from earlier in the year. Another 11% said they were somewhat less likely. Jack Daniels maker Brown-Forman reported that Canadian organic net sales had fallen more than 60%. The company's chief executive called the boycott worse than a tariff. Canadians were not waiting for their government to act. They were acting on their own. Provincial governments moved Canadian spirits and wines to the front of liquor store shelves and removed American products from prominent positions. Buy Canadian labels appeared on grocery store products. Travel agencies reported a collapse in bookings to American destinations. The boycott was not organized by Ottawa. It was built from the ground up by millions of Canadians who watched their government pull an advertisement and decided they had something to say about it too. The Gordie Howe International Bridge threat was the most recent escalation and the most revealing. Trump posted on Truth Social that he would not allow the bridge to open. He claimed the bridge was built with virtually no American content. He claimed Canada owned both sides. He demanded immediate negotiations and said the United States should own at least one half of the asset. Every claim was factually wrong. Canada paid $6.4 billion for the bridge. Michigan already owns half under a 2012 agreement signed by a Republican governor. American steel and American workers built the Michigan side. Rick Snyder, that Republican governor, wrote a public column in the Detroit News identifying the factual errors one by one and warning that blocking the bridge would primarily harm American businesses and Michigan workers and deliver a windfall to the Moran family, private owners of the competing ambassador, bridge, and major Republican donors. Carney called Trump the next morning, stated 4 facts. Canada paid. Michigan already owns half. American steel and American workers built it, and I look forward to its opening. The White House continued issuing statements about Canadian ownership after Carney had already publicly corrected those claims. Michigan's governor, senators, and former governor all pushed back against the president. The bridge is opening. The threat did not work. And the Maroon family's monopoly is ending whether Washington approves or not. The broader lesson from the bridge episode cuts to the heart of why Trump's pressure campaign kept failing. Every target he chose had American stakeholders who needed it just as much as Canada did. Michigan needed the bridge. American auto companies needed the trade corridor. American airlines were operating Canadian-built aircraft. American farmers needed Canadian fertilizer. American refineries were running on Canadian oil. There was no pressure point where blocking Canada did not simultaneously block something American. Step back from the individual threats and a pattern becomes visible. Trump's pressure campaign was designed to achieve one of 2 outcomes. Either Canada capitulates and accepts American terms, or Canada suffers economically until it has no choice. Neither happened. What happened instead is that Canada got faster. The fentanyl tariffs pushed trade diversification into high gear. The 51st state rhetoric handed Carney an election mandate. The China deal was signed before Trump finished threatening Canada for pursuing it. The aircraft decertification collapsed under its own legal contradictions. The bridge threat ended in a phone call. Carney said it in Davos. Middle powers must act together, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. That was not a speech. It was a description of a strategy already running. 12. New economic partnerships. 1.5 trillion in European capital through Luxembourg. 7 billion in new export markets through China. A biennial policy redirecting 70 billion to domestic suppliers. The trade agreement review, coming later this year, will be the most important moment in the Canada-United States economic relationship in a generation. Trump's team will arrive expecting a Canada that spent a year under pressure and emerged desperate for relief. What they will find instead is a country that used every week of that pressure to build alternatives it did not previously have. Canada still sends roughly 2 to 3 of its exports to the United States. That dependency is real. It does not disappear because Carney gave a speech in Davos or signed agreements in Beijing. The vulnerability is genuine and both sides know it. But what changed is the trajectory. Every month that the trade war continued, that 2-3 share shrank slightly. New customers in Brazil, new agricultural agreements with India, expanded manufacturing trade with Europe. The direction shifted. And in trade relationships, direction matters as much as current position. Trump understood something about Canada that previous American presidents had not needed to articulate. Canada is indispensable. Its resources, its geography, its energy, its minerals, its water, all of it sits next to the largest economy on Earth, with no ocean in between. The question Trump tried to answer through pressure is who controls the terms under which Canada supplies those things. Carney's answer has been consistent since the first tariff landed. Canada controls those terms. Canada decides who gets access, at what price, under what conditions. The trade agreement review is where that answer gets tested. Every threat Trump issued gave Carney the domestic argument he needed to accelerate what Ottawa was already planning. And with every escalation, a new Canadian partner appeared somewhere else in the world. Trump threatened, Carney built, and the results are not even close.